Hello and welcome to today's webinar, U.S. EPA Webcast, Resilient Design Assistance in the Mid-Atlantic. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items. Audio is available through your computer's mic and speakers or by telephone. Your call-in number and access code are in the control panel box on the right-hand side of your screen. All attendees have been muted to minimize background noise. If you have a question during the webinar, please type it into the questions box on the upper right-hand side of your screen. We will have a dedicated time to answer questions at the end of the webinar. And if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please contact us and we'll try and troubleshoot the issues. And now we'll start off with a few poll questions. The first poll question is, how many people are viewing this webinar? I'll give you about 20 seconds to complete, and then I'll close the poll. Thank you so much for your responses. And now we're going to move to the second poll question. How many years of experience do you have with green infrastructure? And I'll give you again about 20 seconds to complete, and then we'll move on. Thank you so much for answering the poll questions. And now I'd like to turn things over to Matt King. Matt works in EPA's Office of Wastewater Management, where he is a member of the Green Infrastructure team. His work focuses on engaging national stakeholders to encourage the implementation of green infrastructure practices and prevent stormwater pollution. Thanks for joining us today, Matt.
Thank you, Colby. I'd like to thank our audience for joining us today, and also give thanks to today's presenters for being part of EPA's Green Infrastructure Webcast series. This webcast series features industry experts and professionals from across the country for the purpose of sharing their expertise on a variety of green infrastructure related topics. Today's topic is Resilient Design Assistance in the Mid-Atlantic, and now it's my pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Jason Bernagros. Jason is a water resources planner and researcher with EPA's Office of Research and Development and has been with EPA for 12 years. Jason has a Bachelor of Science in Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences and a Master of Landscape Architecture from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and is a LEED accredited professional. He focuses on developing and applying engineering with nature, green stormwater infrastructure, low impact development, and sustainable transportation planning tools, fostering collaborative partnerships, and delivering transformative technical assistance programs for communities and water professionals across the United States and Latin America. Take it away, Jason.
Thank you very much, Matt. And thanks everyone for participating in this webinar today. We really appreciate your time. I'm going to provide a little context to some of the Mid-Atlantic case studies that the other presenters will be discussing. So just so you all have some background on what we mean by resilient design assistance, I just wanted to give some history on how we put together this design approach. Back in 2016, EPA had invited a guest speaker named David Wagner, who's the president of Wagner and Ball Architecture and Environment. They're a firm based out of New Orleans. And David had presented on this design approach called Living with Water, which is a very holistic way to think about how to make cities adapt to having water present throughout an urban environment at a city scale or a watershed scale. And this was done for New Orleans a few years ago as part of how to make New Orleans more resilient to a lot of the extreme storm events that they see frequently. And with that talk, EPA's Water and Technology Innovation Initiative thought about how could EPA pilot out some type of a design assistance approach that could build off of some of that work that was done in New Orleans. And what we did was to look at how EPA has been doing some pilots with integrated hazard mitigation planning with a few states and municipalities across the country. And that gets to how to integrate green infrastructure and low impact development practices within a hazard mitigation planning context at a state or a regional level. And we wanted to build off of those pilots and think about how we could have a design assistance approach that would look at how to show different typologies of design within a city, a region, or a watershed that could highlight how green infrastructure and low impact development practices could make cities more resilient to extreme storm events, and also starting to think about what other types of tools are or data are in the toolbox for planners and designers, such as looking at real-time controls, looking at predicted data on floods that may occur a few days or a week ahead of time, and taking some of those data and technologies that can be added upon green infrastructure and low impact development practices. We came up with this design approach called the Resilient Design Assistance tool. And we worked with our regional offices in identifying a few communities to pilot out this design assistance approach. And these were communities that had worked with EPA's Office of Water in the past with doing integrative hazard mitigation planning. And with that, we are very, very excited today to highlight a couple of these pilots that were done in the Mid-Atlantic this past year. And with that, we'll let the next speaker take it from here.
Now we'd like to introduce our next presenter, Samantha Rachko. Samantha is a life scientist and grants project officer at EPA Region 3 in the State and Watershed Partnership section. She has been with EPA for 3 years. Samantha has a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science from Drexel University and a Master of Science in both Environmental Policy and Public Communication, also from Drexel University. Her focus at EPA Region 3 is green infrastructure, managing state grants, and science communication. Thank you, Samantha.
Hi, everyone. So Jason gave us a nice little introduction to Resilient by Design, or Resilient Design Assistance, but I will tell you a little more. It's a tool being supported by the US EPA, and its main goals are to help communities develop an innovative and implementable vision of distinctive, environmentally friendly neighborhoods that incorporate innovative green infrastructure systems to address both flood management and water quality needs. We can go to the next slide. So for this assistance, 2 communities in Region 3 were chosen. The first one was Huntington, West Virginia, and the second was Seaford, Delaware. As part of this assistance, we started with the charrette, which is just a term that means workshop, and we carried out charrettes in both of these locations. On this slide, you can see pictures of those charrettes. We have some community members from each. Next slide. So the area of Huntington was chosen for a couple of reasons, and in particular, we focused on the area of West Huntington. And it was chosen for its recent revitalization efforts, and it has a strong history of flooding and a need for flood management, and also its location within the city. In addition, EPA Region 3 already had a pretty established relationship with Huntington based on a previous charrette that we did in 2017. In that charrette, there was locations chosen for possible design, but this charrette really helped us narrow down more of that design, and I'll let Bree talk about that later on. Next slide. In Seaford, they were also chosen because of their recent revitalization efforts, and they also have a recent problem with population decrease. So they're trying to sort of reinvent themselves and get more people to come in. And they're also trying to build their resiliency to flooding impacts. And I can actually talk a little bit more about Seaford, since there won't be a presenter from Seaford. I can show you guys some of those designs. Next slide. So the overarching goal of this Resilient Design Assistant was to set these communities up for success. The main output of the charrette was going to be this conceptual design that they could use to leverage funding and sort of have a starting point. We also, as an outcome of these charrettes, we kind of brought the community together and got ideas flowing and made a strong case for other people who wouldn't usually participate in these kind of activities to get involved and come to the charrette and find out more about what's going on in the community and how we could sort of make them more resilient. There was also a funding session in each charrette. There was a lot of public outreach. And then the next step would be sort of the engineered design. And hopefully they can, eventually apply for implementation funding to really get these projects on the ground. And then lastly, get them thinking about maintenance of these projects so that they are sustainable for a long period of time. We can go to the next slide. So this is a design from the city of Seaford. This is High Street from Cromwell Street to Cannon Street. And as you can see in this design, the main best management practices, or BMPs, are the permeable pavement and also the stormwater planters. I don't know if you guys can see the entire key, but there was several kind of bump out and bump ins that included the permeable pavement and the stormwater planters. We can go to the next slide. So for this one, this was probably my favorite design for the city of Seaford, because it really had both flooding management and had incorporated some nice bioretention, but also it really, I think, would help the community appreciate the Nanticoke River, because at the end of it, you can see on this right side, they have sort of a little overlook platform, which would bring probably more recreation into this area, because it's kind of like a dead end here, and it didn't really serve a purpose besides it had a storm drain at the end. It had some flooding and some trash buildup, but I think the bioretention would really help with that, and the overlooking platform would bring people out to look at the river and really enjoy the space more. We can go to the next slide, and I'll pass it off to Bree, I think, after this.
Thank you, Samantha. Now we'd like to introduce our third presenter, Brianna Schell. Brianna is the Planning Director for the City of Huntington, West Virginia. She works in the Department of Development and Planning and has been with the city for 8 years. Brianna has a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from Denison University and a Master of Urban Planning from the University of Michigan. Currently, she is active in community and economic revitalization efforts in several neighborhoods in Huntington, improving safe and quality transportation options for cyclists and pedestrians, on-road and off-road bike and pedestrian trail, the Paul Ambrose Trail for Health, and continually working with the community to update zoning ordinances to be more in line with the Comprehensive Plan Update, Plan 2025. Brianna is currently on the boards of the statewide West Virginia Complete Streets Advisory Board and Unlimited Future, a business incubator. Take it away, Brianna.
Thank you. As was mentioned, I've been working with the city since about 2012, and basically the entire time that I've been working in some capacity in this neighborhood of West Huntington. So I'm really excited to share how the EPA has strengthened some of those things that we've been able to do in this neighborhood. Next slide, please. So first of all, I did want to give kind of a quick overview of the timeline of the types of work that we've done in this neighborhood, because I think it does provide some important context for how we thought about the resilient design assistance that we're here to discuss. As I mentioned, I've been working in this neighborhood in some ways throughout my tenure, starting in the fall of 2012, early 2013. The administration decided to form a group of city law enforcement, business, and community leaders and residents to come together to address a crime hotspot that had been occurring in this neighborhood, and that began what was called the River to Rail Committee. Soon after that was completed, at the end of 2013, we finalized the citywide comprehensive plan update, Plan 2025. So we've been able to advance the Plan 2025 goals and the strategies of the River to Rail Committee on what I consider a pretty shoestring budget by applying for great free technical assistance programs that occur across different programs. And this began with a Smart Growth America planning for fiscal and economic health technical assistance in 2014. And then soon after 2015, we worked on a local initiative of the American Institute of Architects Livable Communities workshop to focus on kind of the neighborhood Main Street elements and how to develop that. Not long after that final report was presented, we decided to partner again with our stormwater utility and thankfully the EPA, and were awarded kind of our first technical assistance help, which helped us lead that Green Street charrette that was mentioned earlier. And that's where we reviewed 3 different road conditions within the neighborhood to analyze some best practices for implementation in these different scenarios. So again, we were lucky to follow that up with the pilot project for the Resilient Design Assistance, where we focused in on one street section that we felt had more potential to be developed, integrating green infrastructure. So all of that to say, in quick, that this neighborhood has really felt the effects of planning fatigue over the years. We've really been fortunate to be able to partner and participate with a lot of different agencies, but we have to balance that with justifying in the neighborhood, what are we doing when we come to another workshop, charrette, or a planning meeting? And I mention that because it was really helpful when working with EPA leadership to address this head on. And I'm going to quickly run through kind of some summary of these planning efforts and our strategy for creating a public process with our resilient design plan that definitely focused on something coming to fruition from these planning efforts. So next slide, please. So just quickly, I wanted to mention that we are a city that has our flooding and stormwater issues. We have a combined stormwater and sanitary system. About 80% of our lines are combined. And so flooding concerns and stormwater issues have been a major concern of this administration and was addressed in our comprehensive plan update. And in particular, in this neighborhood, we addressed the fact that we would love to consider integrating stormwater management or green infrastructure practices on site to better integrate transportation improvements as well that we know are needed. We recognize that we're not going to be able to solve all of our stormwater problems by replacing every single pipe in the city. We need to deal with how stormwater infrastructure is being managed on site. Next slide, please. So that brings us to how the Green Street charrette worked. So we were really, as was mentioned, kind of focusing in on this neighborhood already. So we really had the community effort behind it. And there was interest in focusing on this section of road in the West Huntington neighborhood that was unimproved. It was a gravel road, but it's like this important connection between the neighborhood and this main street that is very popular for antique dealers and is kind of coming back for the local food scene in Huntington. So we were looking at this stretch of road, Virginia Avenue, between 13th Street West and 14th Street West, but it didn't have any stormwater management built in. And so we wanted to kind of think about this section of road during the Green Street charrette. But we also took the opportunity to think about how different road conditions might apply. So that way we could use some of this work that we were doing to see how it would apply in different situations across the city. So the second road section that we looked at in Huntington was on Adams Avenue between 52 and 14th Street West. And this road is actually a state route that runs through city limits. It's a major thoroughfare. It's a one-way, wide, multiple lane road. And so it had very different conditions than the Virginia Avenue section. And then finally, we looked at Madison Avenue between US 52 and 14th Street West, which is kind of on the other side of the historic Main Street district that we are focusing on as part of our community revitalization efforts. And Madison Avenue is actually a local city-owned road, and it's a two-way connector, and so has some ability to be changed on more of a local level. So those three different street sections had very different elements to it, and we used the Green Street charrette to kind of focus on how the green infrastructure could kind of be implemented in different contexts. So next slide, please. So this brought us to kind of the pilot project with the Resilient Design Assistance. In designing this, based on all of the feedback that we had already done through the Green Street charrette and other input from the community, we really had a lot of partners on board already. So we were just kind of bringing together the group in the different ways. We did try to engage some new partners because of the aspect of implementation of the green infrastructure. We talked with our Marshall University, which is our local university in town, to discuss ways that the engineering professors and classes could potentially use something like this as a way to think about the theory of what they've been studying to practice in a real-life situation in Huntington. So those were some really interesting partners to bring in and engage in this particular process that we hadn't engaged in the past. So beyond that, we followed the method that Sam brought forward earlier in the slide, in the presentation. We did some site visits. We had a charrette and workshop to kind of brainstorm ways that we felt like the road could be improved. And next slide. And we were able to kind of come up with some opportunities, challenges, and recommendations building off of the concepts that we had before, but at more detail. And what was really great about this particular program that I think was different than some of the other programs that I've been a part of is we went a step further after this general concept idea of what will we like to see and took it to the next level with using more technical expertise. So the next slide, please. So after we had this community workshop and kind of prioritized the concepts that we would like to see, the consultant that was on board with the project actually took these draft community design elements and used the EPA National Stormwater Calculator to determine if these proposed bioretention elements would actually be enough to handle some of the localized flooding issues that we've been having in this particular street section. And that allowed us to be able to have like much more concrete feasibility design plans that were at a level that we hope will be able to get us to a point that we'll be able to apply for design and construction plans. So this is a new tool that I even became aware of through this process. So the National Stormwater Calculator, I think we have a link on this website or this page, and I think we can show a little screenshot of what that looks like. So that national stormwater calculator was able to give us information about how the different bioretention elements were able to produce what we needed. Next slide, please. And it was also able to give us some ideas on a range of costs for construction as well as maintenance. So you can see here we kind of shared the construction costs range from about $42,000 to about $59,000, and the costs for annual maintenance were summarized as about $130 to about $3,000 per year. So again, those were kind of like much more detailed information than we've been able to get from kind of these concept design plans that we've had in the past. So we felt very lucky to be able to use that tool. Next slide, please. And so all this kind of culminated into these design plans that were created for us. And we're hopeful that with this level of detail of design plans that we'll be able to go to our metropolitan planning organization where we're able to get transportation funds to be able to say that we have a decent idea of what kind of changes we would like to have implemented at the street level, and more detail than we did in a concept plan, and to really be able to find out some solutions for these localized flooding issues, as well as improving kind of the complete streets livability of this neighborhood. I did want to point out that if you're interested in looking into more detail into any of these plans, they are up on our website at thecityofhuntington.com. The link is there. And then the next slide, I believe we have a screenshot of kind of what that looks like. All of these are hyperlinked, so you can have access to the stormwater calculator as well as the reporting that was provided to us through the Resilient Design Assistance. Next slide, please. All right, so just quickly, I wanted to mention that we still are planning and working very much in this neighborhood. We have an ongoing National Endowment of the Arts Our Town grant that's focusing on a cultural arts and district plan and how people come and go from that district plan to the downtown as well. We are working on implementing a bike and pedestrian connection between our two off-road trail sections to the north and south of this neighborhood, which we're excited to get started on. And most importantly for this project, we are still hoping to do a demonstration project to share these plans with the public and those who participated in our workshop in an event that can potentially showcase the types of changes that we would like to see in a fun way and really come back full circle with the community so that way they can show that we are advancing this to get closer to construction. And then again, I guess my final reflection on the process is that it's been very helpful to get a step closer to implementing the construction of this type of a change, but we are still dealing with some struggles when it comes to how to answer the question of maintenance in particular. In our city, typically these types of trees and things in the streetscape are maintained by our street division or by adjacent property owners, and they don't necessarily have the specialty training or education that would come with maintaining a bioretention feature different than like a street tree. So we need to really consider that thoughtfully before we move forward with any sort of design and construction plans. But we do intend to continue to keep following up with the community and focusing on small wins. And we're really thankful for the EPA's partnership and working with us on advancing these plans. So on that note, I'll turn it back up to Sam to finish it up.
All right, thank you, Bree. I'll just touch on some lessons learned from this whole process. And I should also give credit to Ken Hendrickson, who really owned this project throughout the whole thing. And he recently left EPA for the Park Service, but this was really his baby, and he saw it through completely and deserves credit. But I'll try to present the lessons learned as best on his behalf. And I would just say that, first of all, having the right partners and stakeholders is important. Without the help of Bree and Sherry and others from Huntington and those from Seaford, this really wouldn't have worked. They were very willing to move forward and work with EPA every step of the way, and give us lots of feedback, and just willing to do everything to plan these charrettes and move them forward, and getting the word out in their communities to get people involved and to get people to come. And they were great pre-charrette planning partners, and also partners during the charrette. And I would also say that second, the pre-charrette planning in the sense of the data collection and the site visit and the maps of the area, that was all really important, and Bree helped us with all of that as well. But EPA Region 3 also did go do a site visit and bring out the contractor to come look at the streets and just get a sense of the areas that could be put into this design. We also had this mini workshop where we had some maps, and then we had sort of like game pieces that represented the best management practices, and this really gave us a sense of like what the possibilities were. This is a really good exercise if you can get your hands on something like this. Next slide. History and context. I'll just say that in both Huntington and Seaford, those communities already had lots of ideas and plans before EPA came into the picture. I think that EPA coming in probably just helped solidify this and get them a partial design. But even in Seaford, they had, nothing engineered, but they had like even drawings of what they envisioned for these streets. And I think that was really important coming in, and also just having options for which streets were possibilities. Obviously, EPA doesn't know these towns as much as the people who live there and who work there and who know their community. So it was really important that they had ideas about where green infrastructure could be implemented before we got there. The next thing is charrette length. I'll say that this is really important because we've done 1-day charrettes before and 2-day charrettes, and it's a toss up sometimes because it's really hard to get people to take 2 whole days off from work. But just it always seems better when we do longer ones, when we do 2-day ones, and maybe even longer than that would be beneficial, because the first day is just the introduction, and then it's sort of good to get people to go home and like think about these things and then come back and then do like a workshop, or actually get time to like process the design and just think about ideas. And I think length is key here. And then charrette scope, just thinking about a focus area again. When we went into each of these communities, there were probably 3 or 4 options for where these green infrastructure projects could be implemented, and we had to go in and sort of narrow it down to just a couple and see what was actually feasible. Next slide. And that is it. And if I could pass it back to, I think, Matt for reading the questions.
Hey, this is Colby. I'll handle the questions. Thanks
Colby,
so much,
sorry.
Sam, and thank you to, oh, no worries. Thank you to all of our presenters today, too. This is just a friendly reminder. If you'd like to send in some questions, you can do that via the questions box, which is located in your control panel. We've gotten a number of questions so far. The first question I have is for Sam. Was crosswalk design seen as a positive from traffic engineers? The audience member also mentioned that they were trying to implement some artistic elements with crosswalks, but their traffic division kind of saw it as a distraction.
I think that, and Bree, correct me if I'm wrong, that artistic designs in crosswalks were an issue in Huntington because they were worried that the public may not interpret them as crosswalks. So
yes, thank you. Yeah, I can jump in on that, Sam.
Okay.
It is something that we've done a little bit of research on other communities doing. What we ended up doing when it comes to adding those kind of artistic elements in our city is we've been able to do them as kind of pilot art projects. So we actually go through the Council of the Arts and say that we're doing kind of a temporary art project, and it just happens to cross a street. And so the one image that I did show that we completed, I believe after the technical assistance, was done in that format. And then we're hopeful that we'll be able to kind of work with Public Works and the West Virginia Division of Highways to make sure that we can do something more permanent, meeting their guidelines. So, but there's lots of great examples out there. I'd be happy to share that talk about how other communities have navigated that. But that's how we approached it.
Great. Thanks, Bree and Sam. The next question we have is for Bree. An audience member asked, what methods of public communication were most and least useful in increasing and maintaining the public's engagement?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that I've really struggled with over the years. I mean, I think we always kind of do the typical elements of an email list or the neighborhood association, or kind of the methods of organizations that already exist within the neighborhood, whether that be churches or groups that are engaged already. I will say in the course of another project that's been occurring in this neighborhood, the engagement that I've been surprised by that's like brought out new residents to meetings that I haven't seen before, which is really exciting, has been actually doing a direct mailing on something in particular. Now that's a more expensive outreach method in some ways, but it was a way for us on another project to really reach people that we hadn't traditionally been able to reach, and was decently successful. Now we did that in a pretty targeted way, but so on this project though, I think we really relied on the groups that were already engaged in meeting in this neighborhood and kind of used them as the method of getting out new efforts that were happening in the neighborhood.
And I think the same was true for Seaford. There wasn't many people that were super involved in the process like right away, but really just the people that were already planning this stuff and trying to make this stuff happen had some people engaged, and really working off of that group and getting others involved through them was really important. And I think just spending time in the community, like building up to the charrette, was really important. And they knew that something was going on. Even like when we were doing the site visit, like people would ask us like, hey, what are you guys doing there? And it would give us some time to tell them a little bit about it. And that seemed to be like even useful. I know it's not electronic or, traditional outreach via email and inviting them to the charrette, like, through invitations, but it really helped that we were there and they saw us and we were doing surveys and stuff like that.
Great, thanks Bree and Sam. The next question we have, an audience member asked, how will you measure improvement of stormwater control for this project?
I would say they need to be implemented first. Bree, do you have anything to add on that?
That's a really good question. I think, as was mentioned, this was a partnership between our planning office and our stormwater utility, and our stormwater director wasn't able to be on the conference with us today, but they're definitely trying to work on best practices for, we've been doing a lot of work with our private industries to integrate green infrastructure into new private development, but we have to step up our game when it comes to integrating it into the public side. And I think a lot of that is that question that you mentioned, is how are we going to measure the improvement? I mean, beyond the fact that we hope that we'll see less localized flooding events. And so we've seen that in some places with the private investment of green infrastructure happening on site with new development. but I don't know that we're doing a very good job of capturing it in number format, so that way we can say for sure how that's going to be done. But if anybody has ideas on that, I'd love to hear them.
Great, thank you. Another audience member asked, how can communities apply for EPA technical assistance?
I can take that. So there are a few different types of technical assistance related to resilient design and planning that EPA regional offices work in identifying communities that would be suited for them. Right now, there are two types of resilient planning tools that are being used within communities, and I'm just going to mention them because they are likely to have future calls for working with other communities in the future. So I had mentioned earlier that EPA has been working with a few communities on integrative hazard mitigation planning, and right now EPA is working with five different communities throughout the country on that, and then there's another tool or technical assistance tool that's being offered called the Regional Resilience Toolkit. And that is in its first use through EPA's Building Blocks program. And that looks more at regional planning for resilience, not just looking at extreme storm events, but also looking at different types of hazards such as heat and drought. And that both of those technical assistance tools, the hope is to be able to work with additional communities in future years. So I think the short answer is that the EPA regional offices will work in identifying community partners to work with in the future.
Great, thank you, Jason. Another audience member asked, does your MPO require green infrastructure in projects they approve funding for? And that's for Bree.
Yeah, thank you. I don't believe it is a requirement. They do require that you have to, meet kind of the MS4 standards or the combined sewer. I don't know that acronym off the top of my head, but you do kind of have to show that you are meeting those standards in some way. It doesn't necessarily have to be green infrastructure, but I think they might prioritize improvements that have some sort of kind of a complete streets livability component to it, whether that be green infrastructure or bike and pedestrian facilities and those kind of things, but it is not a requirement.
Thanks, Bree. Another audience member question, this one also for Bree. Has there been interest from residents involved in charrettes to incorporate LID elements on their personal properties and have opportunities for engagement or incentivizing of waterfront property owners been identified?
Good question, too. I think there has been interest from the community to integrate some green infrastructure or low impact development projects on the community side, sometimes in pretty small ways, whether that be like a rain barrel workshops or more permeable pavement methods. like I mentioned, we've been seeing a lot more increase in private new construction incorporating green infrastructure practices because it's a requirement of bigger developments. So I think people are seeing it more often in the community, so they get to understand it a little bit better. And then, I'm sorry, the second part of that question again.
Sure. Have opportunities for engagement or incentivizing of waterfront property owners been identified?
I don't know that we have incentives in place. I mean, the only incentive, I guess, financially is kind of a reverse incentive is that we do have a impervious pavement fee that comes with the stormwater utility for large kind of commercial development. So that you can have some of that fee reduced by having less more pervious surfaces. So I think we could do better to kind of provide more kind of tactics to incentivize in a positive ways besides just education and kind of community events, which the stormwater utility has been doing more often.
Great, thanks, Bree. We have another audience question. Someone asked, what is the Resilient Design Assistance Tool? Is it a process or a guidance document?
Yeah, I can take that. So it's a design approach. So it's a design approach that was adapted from an existing design assistance tool called Green America's Communities, and really in getting a sense of how this design approach is applied, I would suggest to look at the Huntington website that Bree had shown earlier in the presentation to just get a sense of how the design approach is implemented. But in essence, it's really an approach that looks at how various aspects of green infrastructure and low impact development can be piloted out in different types of streetscapes or neighborhoods within a city, and being able to take those designs and think about how they could be applied at a citywide scale, because the idea is that in really being able to help cities become more resilient to the impacts from extreme storm events, that these types of projects have to happen or be implemented at a regional, a watershed, or a citywide scale. But I would suggest that the person who asked this question and others to definitely take a look at the report on Huntington's website.
Great, thanks, Jason. We have another audience question here. This one looks like it's for Bree. Someone asked, you mentioned bioretention maintenance requiring specialized maintenance training. How do you recommend improving this part of the process? For example, engaging maintenance professionals in the design process, or additional review of materials and plant selection?
Yeah, great question too. I think, again, I'm stepping a little bit outside of my lane here in that the stormwater utility, I think, is definitely more of an expert on that than I am in the planning office. But I think what I've heard anecdotally in conversations with their office is, that there are some trainings for contractors to do who may benefit from getting another skill set to do training and maintenance of green infrastructure practices. And so we've encouraged contractors in the area to take that training, so that way they'll be able to help maintain sections of the city that are going that route. Again, I keep coming back to the private development side, but that's been a need that people have asked on that regard too, is that, you know, people are being told you have to maintain this green infrastructure, but there aren't necessarily contractors who are specifically trained to handle the bioengineered soil and, you know, the mowing or that is different, or cleaning of the permeable pavement. And so that's one way, is kind of encouraging contractors to take on new training. And again, at our level of trying to do something on the public side, one thing that we're trying to strategize on as a partnership, again, between planning and stormwater utility, is trying to do a demonstration or a pilot project in a pretty small scale to start, and just get a sense, if we were to do something, what would it look like and what kind of maintenance issues would we run into? What are the realistic costs of maintenance in that range that they gave us for us to be able to maintain? So, but if there are, again, are other people who might know better how to answer that, but that's kind of my initial thoughts.
Colby, there was one opportunity I wanted to mention. In the recent past, there's a new training program that was created under the auspices of DC Water and the Water Environment Federation, and that's called the National Green Infrastructure Certification Program. NGICP is the acronym that you would look up on the internet. This is a program that offers training courses and certification for industry professionals, specifically for the purpose of providing a credential that has to do with the installation and maintenance of green infrastructure. This was a great question, and you know, because maintenance is one of the foremost challenges, you know, in this green infrastructure movement. You know, getting stakeholders and practitioners to recognize that, you know, plants and soils should be considered infrastructure and have to be maintained as such. So I just wanted to mention that NGICP program as something that interested folks should look into if they did want to get some kind of training and certification.
Great, thank you, Matt. Next audience question we have here, it looks like it's for Jason. How much does the EPA coordinate with NOAA for city heat zones in larger urban areas?
That's a good question. I'm not super familiar with the urban heat zones, but I know that we do coordinate with NOAA with the types of green infrastructure design and planning tools that we use, and being aware of the ones that NOAA also uses, especially along coastal areas. One of the things that we utilize a lot from NOAA is a lot of their historical wet weather data. We use that a lot in figuring out how to size green infrastructure practices, but I must admit I am not familiar with that the heat zones concept from NOAA.
Great, thanks, Jason. We have another audience question here. It's more of a general question. Someone asked, when going through this process, is the current global climate change taken into consideration, things, you know, such as rising seawater?
I'll take a first crack at that. So it really depends on which cities are working with this resilience design assistance approach. I think for coastal communities, that can definitely be something that they're wanting to look at future projections of extreme storm events. I know that with the Seaford, Delaware, and Huntington, West Virginia projects, I don't believe that future climate projections were looked at, but I'll let Bree and Sam speak a little more to that.
Yeah, this is Sam. I'll just say that it wasn't initially part of our study, ideas, but I will say that just localized flooding was, and it wasn't. They aren't really coastal cities, so we didn't really think about it that much. But we also just had a climate specialist come into our office, and he's been looking at both locations in that sense. His name is Matt Comfirst. He's at Region 3, and he's kind of like after the fact, like looked at them for that. But initially, we didn't. We just focused on localized flooding.
Thanks. We have another audience question. Someone asked, can you talk more specifically about the resilient design assistance approach? Is it similar to the LEAD in process?
What, that last part, was it the LEAD process?
Correct.
In some aspects it is, but I think just going back to a few questions ago, that it's really the resilient design assistance approach is just really thinking what opportunities there are for a large application of on-site green infrastructure practices throughout a city or a watershed. I think in regards to what LEAD has with stormwater management, I think a lot of the design approaches in LEAD are similar to what have been done with the Huntington and Seaford case studies. But I would say that we really, with the design work that was done, our intention was to be able to show what the runoff reductions would be from these designs, but then thinking about, okay, we have a set of designs that are applicable throughout these two communities, and really thinking strategically about how to apply them throughout these communities. So there are connections to how LEAD addresses on-site stormwater, but I think we're really looking at how to apply this type of design work at a larger scale.
Great, thanks, Jason. We have another audience question. Someone asked, has work through any of these projects led to a restoration or integration of urban streams back into the fabric of the city?
Bree, did you want to speak on that one in Huntington?
If any of the project helped create revitalize an urban stream, not in our situation, just because of the work that we were focused on was more dealing with kind of build up of land that was creating flooding in situations based on increased development and pervious surfaces, so localized flooding issues. Although we do have those issues in other parts of the city, this wasn't the focus of this particular project.
Great, thanks. We have another audience question here. Someone asked if the PowerPoint or recording will be available for download after the webinar, and I'll direct that one to Matt.
Yeah, I just want to let our audience today know that a recording of today's webinar, along with a PDF copy of the slides, will be made available on our program website in approximately 2 weeks. So if you circle back with us then at www.epa.gov/green infrastructure, you'll be able to access those resources.
Great, thanks, Matt. We have another audience question. Someone asked, are there any outcomes for people in quantitative terms for how these projects will make the community more resilient?
I can take a stab at that, and maybe if Bree wants to say something after, but I'll just say that I really hope that in Seaford, this will not only make them resilient because they have, less localized flooding, but also bring more people in. And, when they have a better population, they'll be more resilient because there'll be less blight, and there'll be more people appreciating the actual city. And then in Huntington, I would say the same, just because they have a long history of these flooding problems that cut off part of the city. So I would hope that those can be mitigated by implementing these projects.
Yeah, again, this is Bree. I mean, I think the thing that we're struggling with that is not unique to Huntington is just the amount of infrastructure updates that need to happen in order for us to fix the combined stormwater and sanitary system. So our other tangential goal with finding funding to do pieces of that is to reduce as much as possible on site going into our stormwater system. So that's where I think this tool has helped us. Now, whether or not we can quantify that yet, I don't know if we can, but I think we've definitely changed at least some piece of kind of the education of the community that these are other tools that can exist besides replacing pipes. So that was a piece of that.
Yeah, and I'll just add to in the design and planning process for both Seaford and Huntington, one of I think the ideas in using the National Stormwater Calculator was to be able to get planning level estimates of gallons of stormwater that would be managed with the designs. So having those numbers, and also what the planning level estimates of the construction costs and the average annual maintenance costs would be. I think those types of data at a planning level are super important to get a sense of what type of funding would be needed for construction, and then thinking about existing resources for conducting maintenance.
Great, thanks. Another audience question. Someone asked, over the course of the project design, was there consideration of how to get credit for specific green infrastructure features under the community rating system?
This is Bree. I'll jump in and make sure I understand the question. The community rating system to kind of reduce potential issues for the flood insurance program. I'm assuming that's the reference that they're making there. We have investigated the participating in the community rating system to reduce some of the flood costs, the insurance costs for our citizens, and we haven't yet completed that application, although we do anticipate that we have some things in our toolbox that would help that program. But I think green infrastructure is definitely a piece that we've improved over the years and would hopefully improve our ability to apply for that program and be successful to reduce the insurance costs for our citizens. But it is not something that we've successfully implemented yet in Huntington, but we would look forward to doing that.
Great, thanks. We have another audience question here. Someone asked if we could just try and repeat where there's training for maintenance and where those opportunities are, and also if there's a certification program for green infrastructure maintenance.
This is Jason. So I think the training that Matt had mentioned earlier, the National Green Infrastructure. Matt, I'm blanking on the acronym right now. Can you help me? Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. It's the National Green Infrastructure Certification Program, or NGICP for short.
Yeah, I think that is a great training program that's, as Matt mentioned, is available throughout the country. I know that every year now, because there is a lot of interest in maintenance issues with green infrastructure, that there is a national operation and maintenance conference that happens every other year that is done through the American Society of Civil Engineers. So that's a great conference to attend, to hear how lots of different municipalities are dealing with every facet of maintenance. I think to keep an eye out on that one.
Great, thanks Jason and Matt. Another audience question. Someone asked if we could go back to the Huntington concept plan and highlight the ideas community members like the most and those they had concerns about.
This is Bree. I don't know if you want to click on over to some slides that kind of show the concept plan. So in our workshop, we have talk a tiny bit about the context here of this street. We are on one side of a kind of a neighborhood main street that is really on the edge of becoming a really great little district, but not quite there yet, that we're working on. And it is like a highway exit is like a block away from this area that we studied. And as I mentioned earlier, we're trying to connect a bike path north and south, where this is kind of an east-west route. So there's a lot of elements kind of happening adjacent to this street, but not really on this street. And so I think one of the things that we struggled with and liked about this concept design is we wanted to incorporate more spaces for the green infrastructure, but also for a shared use bike path and pedestrian safety. There were some places where the sidewalk was in really great shape and really wide, and in some places it really wasn't existing or didn't feel very safe to walk on. For instance, under the highway underpass was kind of a dark, wet, gross area to walk. And top of the fact that you're having to cross like an exit lane from the highway. And so we really struggled with, how do we mitigate all those different forms of traffic, knowing that a lot of people are walking and biking here, but it's also a very focused interchange for trucks and cars coming off of the interstate and not really paying attention to pedestrians and cyclists. So we went back and forth about a median. Would we want a median? Would we want a separated bike path? Would we want some different elements like that in addition to the stormwater elements? So I think we kind of came out with a compromise of thinking about adding some elements of a shared bike path and then a separated bike path in places. Let's see, other things that were, I guess, a big piece of the community's interest is trying to focus at the intersection of 14th Street West and Madison Avenue, because that 14th Street West is kind of the neighborhood main street. And so there's a lot of attention to that corner, which right now has a gas station, an empty building, a big parking lot, and a Mexican restaurant that has a driveway that runs that whole corner. So I think there was a lot of focus on that corner to not only improve a huge flooding issue, which if you go one slide down, Jason, you can see there's a picture of some of the flooding that's happening on that corner at 14th Street West in Madison. So it was a big area for us to focus on, not only because of some of the localized flooding issues, but because it's kind of a gateway to this neighborhood main street. So I don't know if that completely answers the question, but that kind of was some of the things that we thought about for this kind of area that we were struggling with the pros and cons.
Great, thank you. Another audience member question. Someone asked, what was your experience as the best compromise of the charrette format and scheduling and length?
I can talk about that one. So I think that the day and a half charrette was the best compromise. I can't remember if we did it in both locations, but I know that we at least did it in Seaford, where we sort of did like one full day and then came back the next morning. That was a really good compromise. That wasn't the whole 2 days. It just seemed to be the right amount of time to bring people in and get them back to their like jobs and not take too much of their time.
Thank you. And a follow-up question to that, another audience member asked for the charrette, who was invited and who were the representatives?
So we had like the city planners and like the Breeze of the world and stormwater utility folks, and we had local business owners, we had citizens, we had a pretty good mix in both locations of like local government and also citizens and business owners that were all interested in either solving the flooding problem or just revitalizing their community.
Great.
I would add from Huntington. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I would add from Huntington too, one of our big partners is our MPO, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, which is a great funder for transportation related projects. And so we try to involve them on any planning process from the very beginning. So they were someone that we brought in the Huntington area, as well as the mention of the participants that Sam brought up.
Great, thank you. Another audience question. Someone asked, do you feel the projects that were discussed, did they adequately address other environmental co-benefits such as, green corridor connections, biodiversity, things beyond flood resiliency that were identified as priorities during the charrettes or, engagement sessions? And if so, could you explain how and if the benefit was estimated? And if not, the person would really like if you could highlight what were the barriers to presented that prevented you from achieving those benefits.
That's a long question, but I will try to address co-benefits. I will speak for Seaford and just say that um, the the safety of some of these streets was an issue in the second example that I gave earlier, and just it's kind of like a place where trash collected. So I think that that's a major co-benefit there, that there'll be some structure to that street and it won't just be a kind of a dumping ground. As far as native species and other things like that, I would always recommend that if these projects are seen to fruition, that native species be incorporated, and we really take time to think about the long-term things that we're planting. Trees with not a lot of maintenance, or ones that won't get too crazy big and tear up the sidewalks, or that's what I would say about that. Any other co-benefits you can think of, Bree, besides safety and native species? And kind of, I would say another thing that we were hoping for in Huntington was signage, just like either signage to educate on what these projects were, and then signage to make it clear which businesses were which and which directions were things in the city. And you can touch on that if you'd like, Bree.
Yeah, definitely. I think, as you mentioned, the co-benefit of this project is kind of that complete streets philosophy, that we wanted to green up this street, not only for the flooding issues and the green infrastructure needs, but for pedestrian level comfort and safety, and to give people the concept that they were coming into a place instead of just passing through. And so that's why signage is a big topic in our neighborhood in general, how to signage people to the right place. So that almost always comes up in our community, and we haven't exactly cracked the nut how to do it well, but and kind of like a gateway philosophy, that we wanted people to use this local connector as a way to see the benefit of this neighborhood district that we're aiming to build up. So that was some of the other things that are underlying with the benefit of doing some streetscape efforts here, in addition to making it safer for pedestrians and cyclists.
Great, thank you. And we'll cover one last audience question here. Someone asked how you defined the location of where to place best management practices, and if the BMPs were cost effective.
I can start, Sam, but if you wanted to jump in as far as the technical side of things, I mean, I think we addressed the localized flooding issues in the charrette process, trying to address, where are we seeing flooding, where are our stormwater inlets currently, seeing that the highway was basically free flowing water from the overpass onto our city street. So really trying to get a sense as to, where's the watershed and where is it coming, and how does the grade of the street affect where the flooding waters go when we have a big rain event. And then the technical side, I'm not sure I can speak to how that got incorporated.
Yeah, and I'm also not an engineer, so I'll just say engineering. But Bree, I'll echo your point that it was really important to do the pre-charrette site visits in both places, and also get a sense of where the water's flowing, where the localized flooding is happening. And that all happens, when EPA works with the partners on the ground, and really they're the ones who are seeing what's going on in their community, and kind of like reported back to us on where locations were best. And then the contractor, which was Tetra Tech, worked off of both the data that the community was collecting, but also anecdotally what they were hearing.
Great, thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Matt for closing remarks.
Thanks, Colby. I want to thank our speakers, Jason, Samantha, and Brianna. We appreciate your time sharing your experience with our audience today. You've left us with a lot to think about with respect to how stakeholders can take advantage of these planning processes, advance green infrastructure, and help build communities that are more resilient. I'd also like to thank the folks in our audience for taking the time to join us today. Be sure to check out future webcast offerings at www.epa.gov/green infrastructure. We hope to see you again in the future. And I just want to reiterate that a recording of today's webinar, along with a PDF copy of the slides, will be available at that URL in 2 weeks. So thanks again for joining us today, and have a great day.